in this hypothetical situation, I'm the manager of a food pantry. You come into my food pantry and I say, Will, thanks so much for coming in today. We're really excited to have you here. A wonderful farmer has donated a massive box of acorn squash. And acorn squash is incredibly nutritious. It's a great source of fiber. It's a great source of, I believe, beta carotene and vitamin C, although don't quote me that, I might be forgetting it right now. But you can take as much of the acorn squash as you want. How much of that acorn squash do you actually eat? That is the question.
Welcome to America's Healthiest City. I am Will Melton, your host, and I am excited to bring this show to you today. We're going to explore the systems that support us and how we can innovate those systems to usher more people in our community to a better life. I'm excited to bring our guest, John Jones, professor in the Center for Environmental Studies at VCU. But before I get started, I do want to just remind our guests and anybody who's new to the program that America's Healthiest City is an idea. It is a 10-year initiative to make Richmond the healthiest city in America. It is an ideas board and a website, a radio show, and so much more. I encourage you to visit americashealthiestcity.com and take a look at the ideas that other community members have submitted, submit your ideas, and follow us on social so that you can join the conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to bring John Jones on, and we're going to dive right in. So John, if you wouldn't mind, just introduce yourself to our guest, tell us a little bit about your background, and I've got some questions prepared, but this is going to be just a kind of a freewheeling interview. So.
Great, Will, and I'm really excited to be here. So, as you said, my name is John Jones. I'm an assistant professor in the Center for Environmental Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University, which is, of course, in downtown Richmond. Let's see here. I came to Richmond in fall of 2019, so a couple months before COVID hit. And coming to Richmond and moving to a new place and knowing nobody was certainly quite an experience. But I really love Richmond. I've really enjoyed my time here, despite COVID. Of course, that's been hard on everybody. But despite COVID, I love Richmond. It's a great place, and I'm really excited to continue to work in the community here and try to improve the community and make it a better place. So.
Well, thank you for that. And we certainly have seen the impact of your work already, and folks who walk around campus or in Monroe Park have seen some of your work. So we'll get into that in a little bit, but it's really wonderful. I think one of the things about all the shows that Mike King brings to us on this program is it's about, how we're all working to make the community better. And so America's Healthiest City is about telling those stories, how we get healthier, how we improve well-being. So certainly the work that you're doing, the work that you're going to do is really important to us. And it's important because we want to help everybody in this community understand that if we don't all move in the same direction, we're not going to achieve that collective vision that really does provide benefits to us collectively as a community. So
and I completely agree with that.
Well, I have lived it to some degree, and certainly, as we go to the community and ask for ambassadors to say, join us and come with us, there's some hesitation. People aren't sure that we can accomplish this goal, and people don't necessarily want to hitch themselves to an idea that they see as maybe a little bit lofty. So part of the work that we've got to do with this show is to tell the stories of what is actually happening, where we are, what the obstacles are, what the solutions to those obstacles are. And so we could talk for hours, and we can cover a lot of ground, and I'm sure I'll have you back in the future to talk about your work. But I want to start with just something that's kind of interesting to me, because I come from a wonderful family, but as a child, of little means. My father was sick. He had disability income, but he didn't work. My mom would often work multiple jobs, and I saw our community show up to make sure that we were, we had the things that we needed. But that shapes you, and I know that you kind of have a similar story, and that led to some really impactful work at VCU. So I want to talk about the Little Ram pantries, and I don't know as much about it, so I'm going to just let you kind of tell the story about how that kind of came to be and what your involvement is on that front.
Yeah. So right before I arrived at VCU, so in I guess all of 2019, so all of 2019, a coworker of mine at VCU, Professor Youngmi Kim, she's in social work. She was analyzing food insecurity, which is the scholarly term that we use to talk about hunger. So just a little bit more of a technical definition. But when most people think of the word hunger, with food insecurity, it's kind of a good synonym for that. But there are some technical differences, but let's not, unless you want to get into that, we can talk about that. But Dr. Kim was looking at food insecurity on the VCU campus, and she found that 35% of our VCU student population, that's undergrads and and graduates deal with food insecurity on some level. And there's some ranges of food insecurity, and that's really in the weeds. And I guess we can go down that road if you want to, but 35% is a very large number. They're talking over 10,000 students. And one of the big things that Dr. Kim found when they did some qualitative investigation is like, why? And like, tell me more about the challenges that you deal with in dealing with food insecurity. One of the questions that they got at was, there is a food pantry on campus. It's called the RAM Pantry. It's existed since, I believe, 2013. That actually detail, I might be slightly wrong on that, but right around there, it's about 8 years or so, 9 years. But a lot of students said that they felt a stigma around using the RAM Pantry, like that being outed and being seen by people going to this place where you're receiving emergency assistance. A lot of people perceive that to be very negative. And so Dr. Kim was in the process of publishing this research for a number of years, and she let me know and let me see the results of it. And actually just got published kind of recently, so I feel comfortable talking about it. But in fall, let's see here, it's been December of 2020. So I've been aware of this problem for a while, and I was wandering around the Church Hill neighborhood because I've been looking at different neighborhoods to buy a house in Richmond for quite some time, but the housing market's not really great right now, so I've been waiting. But I was walking around the Church Hill neighborhood near, I believe it's Libby Park. And there was a Montessori school there, and there's a little wooden box there that I actively saw a woman when I was walking my dog putting food into this box. And I went up to her and I said, hey, what are you doing? What is this? And she says, oh, this is a community food pantry. And I talked with her a little bit about this, and particularly good timing in that she was actively putting the food in. And it's really kind of a take on the little neighborhood library concept that exists in lots and lots of neighborhoods around the country. And basically and I've actually talked to, I think, the woman that might have founded this movement out of Arkansas, and I think 2016, I think, is when it started, at least as far as I can tell. But it's just kind of taking that little neighborhood library box design and turning it into a little neighborhood food pantry. And so the idea being community residents will maintain this, and then they'll kind of go put food in there, and anybody that's food insecure, they can go and take food as they need it. And there's kind of an anonymous factor to it. Like, it's not really monitored. There's no real policing mechanism for it. Separately, a little bit off of campus, but the RVA Community Fridge Project is spiritually very similar to this, and that organization has been fantastic in setting up community fridges, which is kind of the same idea, but instead of a wooden box, it's a refrigerator that a business is plugged in, and there's just kind of an extension cord running into the building, and then people are putting perishable items into the refrigerators, and they're nice and decorated, and people can go get food, get good resources from them as they need. But I kind of decided to marry those two concepts, because when I thought about the stigma that students face, and like they don't want to be perceived in going and getting emergency food, I said, well, what if we took that idea and kind of brought that to campus and put these little miniature food pantries all over campus? And part of I grew up in poverty, and I was food insecure when I was a college student. At the time, I didn't realize it, but now as a scholar that studies this, I definitely know that I was. My roommates at one point had a nickname for me. I was called Soup because I ate a lot of soup. And so the nickname was Soup, which I don't know, has really just stuck with me over the years. If any of them are listening, thanks, guys. But so my experiences when I was a college student, I wouldn't have necessarily gone. I don't think I would have gone to a food pantry because I would have perceived that there were other students that probably needed it more than I did, and that's probably not really true objectively. I guess I can tell you some anecdotes if you're interested in hearing about that, of my difficulties in dealing with food insecurity when I was in college myself, but. Finding a way to try to mitigate that 35% problem on our campus was really important to me. And so I had the idea of like, let's expand the reach of the campus food pantry to put these little miniature food pantries all over our campuses, with the hope that if we make this more visible, if we kind of put these things in the hallways and people can see them and people will be interacting with them, that hopefully that will actually kind of make it more invisible over time. So it just kind of like fades into the background of campus life. Just like, do you think much about the trash can that's there? Or do you think much about who goes and gets a newspaper from like the student newspaper vending machine box? Do you really think about that? Probably not. It just kind of disappears into the background of, you're walking down the hallway and you're not really thinking about it. And so we're doing some focus groups this semester actually on that exact stigma point, but the pantries have been operating since October of, I guess, 2 Octobers ago now. So it's been in October of 2020. There's a wonderful PhD student in engineering has helped me build some sensors into the boxes. So every time the door is opened, it triggers a timestamp. So we know, the gym location at 3:45 p.m. on this date, somebody opened the box. And as of last school year, we had 2,200 times that people have opened and closed the doors of any of the boxes around both of the campuses. And we're going to analyze all this data in much more concerted effort once we finish data collection in May. But the preliminary results are very, very positive. And another big concern that a number of administrators had is that they were worried about, well, this is unmonitored. Was there like potential for vandalism? What happens if people are putting in food that might be spoiled or harmful? We have some safety monitoring that my students and I do to try to make sure that vandalism isn't happening and people aren't putting like dairy products into a unrefrigerated box and then somebody might be drinking the spoiled milk or something like that. And our data collection isn't perfect on this certainly, but I'm not aware of any significant like vandalism or safety issues related to this. And also, I'm happy to report that the data that we have suggests, it's not perfect, but it suggests that when my students and I, we put in a amount of food every Wednesday. So there's a bag of food that we restock every Wednesday. The data that we have is suggesting that as soon as we leave that location, some student isn't just coming in and just taking all of the food out and then taking that home with them. Like we can't answer that perfectly, but to the best of our knowledge, that's not what's happening. And so I think that's a pretty profound statement on humanity and the idea of mutual aid in general, and that a very nihilistic view of humanity would say, oh, well, that's just a bunch of food that nobody's monitoring that somebody could, steal. That's not really happening. Maybe in limited instances, and that's probably okay, actually, if that's happening. Maybe that person really does need it.
Well, I think your own sort of interpretation of your status amongst others in need as a college student is indicative of that exact, empathy that we carry around. So, I will share with you that I personally have, kind of delved into the world of food insecurity. Leadership Metro Richmond Quest class is a 9-month program I took in 2020, started before the pandemic and we ended during the pandemic. But, it was challenging because we went in studying food deserts, which, for those of you who don't know, a food desert is if you're outside of the city, 10 miles to a grocery store, inside the city, 1 mile to a grocery store. We have food deserts in Richmond. But when we started talking to people from Shalom Farms and from these different organizations that are actually feeding people, we found everybody was saying it's not just about feeding people. It's not just about access. It's not just about affordability. It's about so many other things. And so, we want to talk about some of the cultural foundations and the foundations of generational wealth that kind of contribute to these things. But one of the things that I really wanted to kind of think about, and this is a little bit personal to me in the sense that I, have somebody in my family who I know many years ago when in college had a similar situation and probably, suffered nutritionally as a result and probably had negative effects on learning and all this. But what I know is that there have been sort of generational impacts of that scarcity problem over the course of, 2 or 4, however long, this went on in college. And so maybe you could speak a little bit more to what your experience was, just like how did it impact your mentality? And do you feel like you fully escaped whatever, sort of shifts happened as a result? And so can you speak to that a little bit?
That's a really good question. That's a lot. I don't know if I can answer all of that. I'll try though. So neither of my parents cooked. And it was only really in high school that I was able to take a cooking class for the first time. That's really when I got exposed to the idea of what is some semblance of nutrition and how you as an adult or an almost adult person can attempt to try to feed yourself. But I like to talk about this in class a lot, is that it's mostly mothers that are recreating food habits for the next generation. And as you said, there's that intergenerational effect. If one of the parents, who probably is the mother, but might not be, doesn't necessarily have good cooking skills, or their socioeconomic situation does not afford them the ability to be able to go cook with their families. If they're working 2 or 3 jobs, they may be the best cook that has ever existed, but you don't physically have the time to do the shopping and do the meal prep, then it's much easier, and logistically you may be the only thing that's possible, to go to a fast food restaurant and go get a complete meal. Because unlike a lot of cooking, which you may create part of a meal, fast food is really good about creating it. They give you an entire meal, like it is a complete experience, as opposed to, oh, I can make pasta, but like that's only just, you just want to just eat pasta, or you just want to eat a salad. Like you need a complete meal there. But when I got to college, I feel like I was food secured during the time that I was on the meal plan, but that was only my first 2 years, so my freshman and sophomore year when I was on the meal plan. But after that, I realized the economics of being on the meal plan really wasn't, like, I was paying a lot of money that I thought I would it'd be wiser to use elsewhere. And so my junior and senior, and then on into grad school, I was feeding myself basically, and I'm a little ashamed to say it now, but in a lot of ways, I'm really not ashamed to say it. Like, my mother was on food stamps, and she was giving me some of the food that she was getting from food stamps to give to me, because there really wasn't any other way that I could really feed myself and still like attempt to try to work a job, and then also try to get done with school effectively, and get done with school enough that I could, succeed and move on into an effective career.
Those
And
bootstraps are right there for you the whole time, right?
only because I've only been able to achieve the things that I have because so many people were there helping me along the way. The bootstraps narrative, I think, it really falls flat, I think, in a lot of ways, because ultimately I had a lot of mental perseverance to get where I am today, but if it wasn't for many, 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 many people helping me along the way, I would not have been able to get myself out of poverty. And really, to answer your question, only since I really got my professor job at VCU, and I have a stable salary now for the first time, and I'm 40 now, so it wasn't until like 37 that I really kind of achieved something what we might call like a middle class lifestyle. I did work in government for a number of years in my 20s, but public service, especially at the entry level, doesn't, generally speaking, pay exceptionally well.
Yeah.
So I struggled for a lot of my 20s, and then most of my 30s was to getting a PhD, and that's a very long process, and you don't really make a lot of money doing that either. So
yeah, I'm not personally a super educated person with regard to having gone to school. I've watched my wife do it. I've watched her go to 3 different programs, and it's hard work. It's long hours. It's a lot of discipline, and I don't have it personally, but you still got to eat in all of that. You got to eat probably more than most people do, because there's a lot of brain energy that's being used.
Brain energy, yeah. Oh yeah.
So, well, I want to talk a little bit about your research, because I think anybody can kind of relate and feel empathy for somebody who doesn't have a meal. And I think what this program is really about is, last week we had on some great people from Underground Kitchen Community First, and talking about how they have fed 250,000 people in the community really healthy meals, and how they've actually helped people with their health and get off of medication and lose weight and all this. And so we know that feeding people can solve the problem, but there are these foundational issues, whether we're talking about culture or psychology or whatever. And so you've identified some of the problem. You've also identified some potential solutions. So I want to talk about a couple of things, one being the acorn squash problem, and sort of that nutritionally rich food barrier that people in poverty face. And then I want to talk about entrepreneurship, policy entrepreneurship, and what that means. So we'll start with the acorn squash problem, and I'll let you explain to folks what that is.
Yeah, so the acorn squash problem is a way of conceptualizing barriers that people experience when they would go to a food pantry and get food from the food pantry. But because we really want people to be eating healthy food from a food pantry. That, I think, is the goal that I think the vast majority of society wants. But there's a big disconnect between a person going to a food pantry and then, are they actually physically consuming healthy food? Why or why not? And so the acorn squash problem, and this actually just comes from an off-the-cuff example that I was giving in class one day to try to explain the complexity of this, and it really resonated with the students. And so I eventually decided, well, okay, I'll write a journal article about that. So that's what I did, and it's available on the internet. If you search acorn squash problem, it's, I think, the second thing in Google. It's an open access paper, so everybody can look at it. But basically, so in this hypothetical situation, I'm the manager of a food pantry. You come into my food pantry, and I say, Will, thanks so much for coming in today. We're really excited to have you here. A wonderful farmer has donated a massive box of acorn squash, and acorn squash is incredibly nutritious. It's a great source of fiber. It's a great source of, I believe, beta carotene and vitamin C, although don't quote me that, I might be forgetting it right now. But you can take as much of the acorn squash as you want. How much of that acorn squash do you actually eat? That is the question.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of and hopefully people that are listening to this start to thinking like, well, what if you can't, the acorn squash is kind of heavy. Like, do you have the ability to carry it home? Like, do you actually know that that is food or not? Do you have the knowledge of how to cook that? Do you have the equipment that you need to cook it? Do you have the knives? Do you have an oven? Is that sort of food culturally appropriate for you or not? For somebody that grew up in Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa or Russia, they might not recognize that is food. And we can take the acorn squash example and we can put it in a different cultural context. I'm German American and I grew up in the Midwest. If I lived in, say, Southeast Asia, and I went to a food pantry in Southeast Asia, and they said, hey, we have a bunch of, say, roasted crickets, which is a very healthy source of protein and very common in Southeast Asian cuisine. That is not a culturally appropriate food for me. And I personally would be very, very turned off by the idea of, hey, go eat a bunch of roasted crickets. But no, I'm not knocking roasted crickets as a food. And honestly, with the way that global climate change is occurring, like a lot more of us might be eating insects in the coming decades than we think that we're going to be. But that's a separate discussion, I guess. So there's a cultural context to this as well, is that the acorn squash problem can exist in other places, but it's this idea that just because the healthy food is there doesn't necessarily mean that that's actually what's going to get consumed. And so we as a society and people interested in emergency food systems, we need to try to correct our thinking a little bit on that point, because I think there's an assumption of, oh, well, I donated this food to the food pantry, therefore somebody's going to consume it. Like that may happen, but that doesn't necessarily happen.
You're listening to America's Healthiest City on ESPN Richmond. I am your host, Will Melton, and you're listening with John Jones, professor at VCU of the Environmental Sciences Center
for Environmental Studies. Yeah,
I knew I was going to get it
close
wrong.
enough. It's okay.
It's
a very long name.
So to make sure we stay on time with the show, I want to talk before we go out about what policy entrepreneurship is and how can that help us solve some of the problems that we face?
Sure. So my idea around policy entrepreneurship is that to try to affect changes to the local food system, government needs to be involved in that. But traditionally, and when I say traditionally, I really only mean in the last maybe 10, 15 years at the most, have major cities across the country started to recognize the idea of we need a public employee who is devoted to trying to improve the food system of that region. However, traditionally, and once again, traditionally in the last 5 to 10 years, that job is conceptualized as in what we call an unclassified way, and that job is appointed at the will of the politician. So the mayor may say, pick a random city. It doesn't have to be Newark, or it doesn't have to be Richmond. The mayor will comes in and says, hey, John, I really want to hire you to improve the food system or whatever. You're going to be a political employee and you're going to work for me. But when you lose election, the new mayor come in and say, hey, I actually really want to focus efforts elsewhere. That job, I'm going to hire somebody else with that headcount. And so all that work, all that inertia to try to change the food system for a positive way kind of goes out the window. And so on some level, I'm advocating that we need classified jobs for people working to try to improve the food system in local government. So that means that they're immune to political pressure. And that's a different type of job classification. This is very in the weeds within public administration, but that's one aspect of what I talk about when I talk about policy entrepreneurship. And then we need entrepreneurs, but in a public setting, working for the public good over long term, and they're protected from potential changes in political winds. Because ultimately, the challenge of how are people going to eat and how can we make sure that our citizens are healthy and residents are healthy, that is a challenge that is going to be present for everybody, and politics shouldn't necessarily matter for that. Who is the mayor, who is the commissioner, that shouldn't matter for that.
Well, I think that's something that we should all be able to get behind, and something I'll certainly carry forward with my contacts and conversations. So I want to remind the audience that americashealthiestcity.com is the website that you can go to engage in the conversation, take a look at ideas that have been submitted to the website, leave your comments, and listen to this show as well as consume other media on what is happening in Richmond to make us a healthier city. On that subject, I wanted to give you a chance to just to maybe throw out some ideas of your own that you would want us to add to the site. And really, this is something that it might be big. Maybe it's something that a company or an organization or government takes on. But we want to think that everybody can move the needle by small ways that can really make a difference. So
yeah, so I'm really interested in encouraging micro and small scale food entrepreneurs. So that could be urban farmers, that could be small scale food producers, that could be the breweries that have kind of popped up at Scott's Addition. I think that's all kind of the same thing. A lot of my work kind of conceptualizes these things as quote unquote urban food enterprises. But in a lot of my work, when I talk to these entrepreneurs, they say that they're actually capable of producing a lot more food than they're actually growing. And so that to me suggests it's a problem of demand and not so much a problem of supply. And so to me, that leads to the idea that we need large public institutions like universities or school districts to make local buying commitments, to be saying, we're going to buy X percentage of the food that we're going to serve in our cafeterias that's going to be sourced from a quote unquote local source. Now, local source could be like 100 miles from the bird flies from downtown. It could be anything in the state of Virginia. You could define local a lot of different ways. But I think moving in that direction will send a demand signal to local producers, local entrepreneurs to say, hey, I could grow a bunch of broccoli at my farm and sell that to, VCU's cafeteria or Henrico School's cafeteria. And so I've spoke to some folks at these different institutions around the region, and broadly they're interested in that. But we need a much more public pressure, I think, to try to encourage these organizations to move in that direction. Because I think that the administrators, I think, are broadly maybe interested in that idea, but I think we need a little bit of a push to kind of move them in that direction. And political leadership potentially could be instrumental in kind of moving in that direction as well.
Well, thank you for that. I know we want to give the audience a chance to find you online, but before we do that, I want you to plug something that you've been working on.
Yeah.
So for farmers that are looking for places in the city, in urban areas to grow food, you've been working on something there. So I want you to plug that, and we're going to bring you back on to talk about it in more detail, but with just about a minute left.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in if we can find ideal places to put urban farms and community gardens. And so I've been working with Chesterfield County, and now we're starting to work with the city of Richmond to try to examine at the political level and examine entire jurisdiction and say, okay, let's look at all the land, and if you can find where are the most ideal locations to put an urban farm or a community garden. And I think that can inform in the short term of, hey, let's get people on those sites. But then also we should be having conversations about, well, if that is really the best land to be doing this sort of thing, we probably don't want a apartment building going on that land. And so we need to engage in preservation or conservation tactics to try to take that land out of market forces so that a developer can't come in and put an apartment building on that spot, because that is really the best spot for a suburban or urban farm or a community garden.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, I can't wait to talk more about that and the progress you make. For the audience's pleasure, where can folks find you online?
So I'm not really much into social media, but you can do a search for John Jones at VCU, and that'll take you to my scholarly webpage. There's a URL, but I'm not super great at it. Maybe we can get it in the show notes or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we'll do it. So, we can't wait to have you back. You've been listening to America's Healthiest City on ESPN Richmond 106.1, 6 a.m. Thursdays. We'll see you next week.